Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
To Medieval Church History, I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt. Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Teresa.
Today's show number 6, and we're going to look at the Germans.
Today we're going to look at the Germans. They're
Go
the
Germans.
darn guys that caused all this thing. Fall of the Roman Empire and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, but it's fascinating stuff. And this is, in a sense, the 6th program is our last preliminary program. We've been pulling all the players together.
Right.
Next week we're going to jump in with the crowning of Charlemagne, and that's where we really get into the course.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and take a look at the last set of players, which are the Germans. Very interesting group of people. And they came into Europe uninvited. They came in because they were trying to get away from some other people who were even meaner than they were.
Oh.
These are the Huns.
Yes.
And they came roaring out of the Asian steppes in the 370s. They had bumped up against the Great Wall of China, was not able to go in that direction, and so instead they turned around, marched all the way across the Eurasian landmass, absolutely incredible journey. And when they got into what is present-day central western Russia, they bumped up against a lot of Germanic tribes. And these tribes, there was no way that they were going to fight these guys, so they turned around and they moved westward themselves. Now, there had been a westward movement of Germans, an interplay of Germans for a long, long time between the Roman Empire and these German tribes. And if you remember that there were some unfriendly relations back around the time of Julius Caesar. Mm-hmm. In the generation after that, the Germans had whooped up on a Roman army, absolutely destroyed a Roman army that had invaded their territory at a place called the Teutoburger Wald. And while there were these bad feelings, at the same time, the Emperor Augustus, I believe, actually had German bodyguards. Wow. So they were back and forth. But as time went on, the Romans came to rely more and more on these Germanic tribes who provide their auxiliary troops on the borders. We talked a little bit about this earlier on, handing off more and more of responsibility for national defense to these foreigners, and proved to be not a good idea, because when these German tribes then spilled over the Roman frontiers, they were met by German Roman soldiers who did not resist. And this really, you shouldn't think of this as being some kind of a formal military invasion. This was much more of a flood by people. Okay. It was a slow inundation of people coming over the borders. However, there were some times when you had some military conflicts. This certainly happened in the East in 376. A Roman army, this is an Eastern Roman army, under the Emperor Valens, marched out of Constantinople to punish a group of Germans. There were 2 Germanic tribes that had come over the Danube River, and they were kind of rampaging around. Actually, I believe what had happened was they had been promised some grain, and the subcontractors gave them bad grain, and they were hungry, and so they just went on a rampage. Well, anyhow, the Romans sent this army up, and they met a German army made up of Visigoths and Ostrogoths. These are 2 Gothic subgroups, and they overwhelmed the Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople. And they killed the Emperor Valens. Wow! So this was a real wake-up call for the Roman Empire. They were not invincible. It's been a long time since a Roman army had been defeated. I mean, you'd have to go back to around 7 BC, 7 AD, whatever the time of the Teutoburger Wald battle was. But it had been a long time, and now this looked pretty bad. And that opened up the whole Balkans area to the ravages of these Germanic tribes. Some of them actually continued on west, thinking that, or hearing that there was rich lands in Italy, and so in 402, some of them entered Italy itself and began moving. So much so that that in 410, the city of Rome itself was sacked.
Wow.
That is to say, they came in and they did their will, whatever they wanted in Rome. This is the first time. I mean, Rome had stood against a lot of enemies. Now, there had been internal enemies, Roman armies against Roman armies, but this is the first time you have a group of barbarians to sack the city of Rome. I went back, and the last time I could find was in 390 BC. This is 410 AD.
Wow.
And unfortunately for the Romans, it became not an out of the ordinary experience. In 455, another group of German barbarians came in. These guys were known as the Vandals, and hence the name gets spread around. The Germans then went off after they had destroyed the city of Rome, vandalized the city of Rome. They went off then into southern Gaul, today southern France, around Toulouse. Some of them began settling down there. Some of them went over into Spain, into the Iberian Peninsula, and settled there. And so these Germanic tribes that had been in central Russia within 2 generations have now moved all the way to Western Europe and are placing themselves in this prime real estate and simply settling in. So what you have are 2 populations there. You've got the Romanized populations. In Gaul, these are Gauls and Romans that intermarried over the generations, and then various Germanic tribes. In Spain, the same thing, long intermingling of Roman and Spanish, and now you have another Germanic population that's there. And in Italy also. And what happens is that the government of the Roman Empire really is just disintegrating from the center. There is no central control anymore. And what you have instead then is sort of an alliance that's made between the local Roman populations. Because these are the people who know things and know how to do things, as we talked about the other week, and the guys with the muscle. And so they are then taken on by the local population as what they refer to as the federati, or the allies.
Okay.
And you're going to have a couple years. It's going to be an opportunity for the 2 groups to get to know each other a little bit, when all of a sudden the bad boys show up,
Right.
the Huns. And they come raiding right along, right into Italy itself, moving right down the Italian peninsula. They are a hot knife going through butter. Wherever they want to go, they go. And of course, they've always heard about the fabled city of Rome, and so they head right for Rome. And there is nobody that can defend Rome against these guys. And this is that wonderful scene where the Pope himself, by himself, goes out, rides out on a white horse, all dressed in white, and confronts Attila the Hun. This is, of course, Pope St. Leo the Great. And the Huns then turn around. Attila leaves and goes back up to Gaul, where he begins going wherever he wants in Gaul, until finally a Roman Germanic army, these are German allies with an organized Roman army, actually stand in his way at a little village called Chalon. And in 451, this allied army actually beat the Huns.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Now, that's a first in history.
Wow.
With that, the Hunnish army moved back toward the east. Attila died. There's big controversy over how he died. Evidently, he had gotten a little bit too drunk, and the toxicity caught up with him. But he died, and with that, the Huns as a force in Europe fade.
Okay.
And it's sort of like disseminate throughout Eastern Europe. Well, the reality is now that by the time you get to the mid portion of the 400s, everything in the West, that old Roman Empire now, is pretty much occupied by various Germanic tribes. And let me just talk about some of them. Okay, one of the Germanic tribes are called the Burgundians.
Oh, okay.
And this particular group hangs together, and they move to the area around Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And eventually, after going through a couple Swiss winters, they think to themselves, the Riviera sounds pretty good. And so they moved off to the French Riviera, and they settled in, actually what they settled in was the Rhone River Valley, the upper Rhone River Valley. Beautiful area. Two cities. First of all, the city of Lyon is there. Lyon's been around for some while. And then also Vienne. And so that'll be one group. Those are the Burgundians.
Okay.
And even to today, they maintain a certain independence. I think we've talked about beef bourguignaise is one of theirs. Also, just the Burgundy as a wine, it is a wine region, is still very famous, and it has a certain independence. All the way through the Middle Ages, Burgundy will be its own country in one way or another, a duchy in one way or another. Then, as you look further north, there's another group of Germans, a large group called the Franks. And the Franks are going to be moving from the east to the west. There are two cities in Germany, even to this day, named after them. Frankfurt am Main is in the west, and then in the eastern part, on the Oder River, is Frankfurt an der Oder.
Okay.
So these are two. And at one time, there was a duchy named Franconia, also in Germany. As they continue moving, they'll move further west to and take over the Roman city of Cologne. It had been called Colonia. And then also a little fishing village of Trier on the Mosel River. And then it continues spreading further west across northern Gaul, where they will eventually bump into the English Channel. And they'll remain there. Now, these people are known in history as the Salian Franks, and literally means salty Franks.
Okay.
Because of the North Sea and the English Channel. They're up against salty water.
Salt water.
Yeah. As opposed to the freshwater Franks. Also, interestingly enough, they give their name to an entire country. Frank is then romanticized to France. That's right.
Okay.
So there's that group. And this is an important player. The Franks are important players. We've already talked about them right at the very beginning of the when we were talking about the Merovingians. That's a dynasty that ruled over the Franks. They are united as a people under Childeric, and then later his son Clovis.
Yes.
And Clovis is the one who converts to Christianity. And then what happens is that not only does he convert to Christianity, but he leads to the conversion of all of the people. All of the Franks then are converted over to Christianity. This is what is referred to as a Clovis moment. This is important because the Christianity that they're converted to is Orthodox Christianity rather than Arianism. Many of the Germans will convert, but over to Arian Christianity. They'll convert to Orthodox Christianity.
Okay.
What comes then is that eventually what had been the Western Roman Empire is eventually going to disintegrate into a whole bunch of Germanic kingdoms.
Okay.
And depending on the different German tribes. Over in Italy, in northern Italy and in central Italy, there'll be Ostrogoths, literally means East Goths. Over into Spain, the Germans that'll be settling there will be Visigoths or West Goths. Those will be Aryans.
Okay.
And there are some of them also in southeastern France. that'll also be in southern France. Some of them will be there also.
The Visigoths too?
Visigoths,
Okay.
yeah. And so it's an interesting part of France. What we'll be seeing later on is it's a little dicey in southern France. They tend to be a little independent in some ways, and so you're going to have an Aryan influence in otherwise Orthodox Gaul. Over in Britain, you still have the Bretons. These are a Celtic people, and they predate the Romans. They've been there before the Romans. Not only are they in Britain itself, and hence the word Britain from the Bretons, but also they're going to be located in Normandy. It's a peninsula on the westernmost coast of France, and another larger peninsula just south of that called Brittany.
Okay.
And again, you see that influence, the Bretons. Later on, there are 3 German tribes that are going to move into Britain. And these will be the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. The Jutes are actually Danish. It's going to be smaller. But the Angles and Saxons are going to be very important because we're going to refer to them as the Anglo-Saxon culture, right? And England will take its name from the Angles. We've already said that the Burgundians were living along the Rhone River. And in the northern France and what is called the Low Countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and then also into the Rhineland area will be the Franks. Now, the kings in these areas have a very different notion. The Germans have a very different notion of territory and rulership from what the Romans had. And so we're going to have to contend with that. They basically considered that the kingdoms were the private property of the king and his family. It's their private property, and they'll let you live there in exchange for something. Taxes. Now, that's a very different idea than the local inhabitants when they arrive. The Romanized citizens of the empire have a very different concept. Their idea is of a civil authority, okay? But that's collapsed. The civil authority of the Romans has collapsed, with the exception of the local areas. In local areas, and especially in the urban regions, there's going to be some kind of authority that's going to survive, and the Germans will respect that authority because these are people who know things and know how to do things. And especially on the lowest level, the organization, remember, on the lowest level was the civitates, the little civic organizations, and those are really going to be saved by and reorganized by the Catholic bishops. These bishops throughout Western Europe are going to put together some kind of civilization and hold it together. And by and large, it's going to be done in the smaller towns and villages and in the cities. That's where civilization is going to be held. And Clovis is going to respect that. And he's going to want to preserve it. And what he does is he creates a parallel government that he refers to as giving various Franks. This will be a nobility, a Frankish nobility. He's going to call them comes, C-O-M-E-S. And we get the word count from that.
Oh, okay.
And so a count will be someone appointed by the king to oversee a region representing his authority, okay? And so the count is going to oversee an area that's known as a county, and hence we get the word county from that. Now, Clovis's family has a murky background to it, which they use to their own advantage. They claim that they are descendants of Merovic, and that hence the word Merovingian. Merovic is supposedly a descendant from a Germanic god.
Okay.
This goes back to Germanic lore. Okay? Not to be confused with the Da Vinci Code saw that that Merovic was a descendant of the union of Jesus Christ and St. Mary Magdalene, which is absolutely debunked. I think we've had plenty of opportunity to debunk that. No one in their right mind actually believes that, but there are a lot of people not in their right mind, and so they're still running around believing that. But the real history, if you look up historians of the period, they're going to trace the Merovingians back to this mythological descendant of a German god.
Okay.
Yeah, so hence the name Merovingians. Now, Clovis extends his conquests out beyond the Franks themselves to the east, and other Germanic tribes in the east, particularly the Thuringians, where we get the sausage Thuringer, and into the south, conquering the Burgundians, and into the further south along the coastline, conquering the Visigoths in an area that is known as Provence. And he dies in 507 A.D.
Clovis does?
Clovis does.
Okay.
He has converted this region to Christianity. He has brought together the Germanic and the Romanized peoples, populations. There is some semblance of order and stability. Okay? And then what happens is that his kingdom is subdivided by 4 children. And the whole history of the violence of the Merovingian families one against the other. Remember, we go back to Chilperic and the man who was Nero and Herod of our times, and his evil wife, witch, Fredegund. Remember how we got started? Well, here's where it is, and it looks as though everything has fallen apart, but it doesn't. The roots that were co-planted by Clovis between the Romans and the Franks are going to continue intertwining and living together. Let me take some of this apart. The Romans, as we had talked about before, carried with this one of the Roman ruins that was not totally destroyed, was the sense of the res publica, of the public thing. A sense that everything is held in, or some things are held in common, whether they be the public bath or public office or whatever. The Franks are going to come in with a very different sense. Everything is based upon personal loyalty, the loyalty of the warriors to their king, the loyalty of their followers to the warrior nobles. So 2 very different points of view, and we're going to see those over a series of centuries bounce against each other, deal with each other, synthesize with each other to come up with a very unique European civilization.
Okay.
You know, the Romans' law is derived from natural law. We talked a little bit about this too. That jurisprudence is one of the great ruins of the Roman Empire, which is not destroyed, but in ruins, needs to be rebuilt back up again. Jurisprudence is based upon justice. It's based upon reason. For the Franks, on the other hand, the idea of law there is the customs of the people that have been inherited from one generation to another. And as such, and here's an interesting point here, as such, no people has the right or should impose their laws upon anyone else. So even when the Franks conquered the Romans, they respect Roman law because it is, in their mind, the customs of the people who are indigenous to that area.
Wow, okay.
Now, we're going to see this next time around played out very interestingly by a pope. Leo III and Charlemagne are going to find themselves in a very, very contentious situation. And the big question is, how do we get out of this? And the answer is going to come from Leo III, who is he's not exactly the brightest candle in the candelabra, He was just an ordinary Roman priest, but he very brilliantly figures out how to use Frankish law and Roman law in order to solve this problem.
Okay.
I'll save that until next time.
Okay.
It's a little teaser. For the Romans, society is a society of responsibility. Everyone has responsibilities. A criminal is responsible for his crime. Now, we take that for granted. We understand that. civil authority is responsible for bringing him to justice. Get that sense of responsibility.
Okay.
Individuals are responsible for their acts. Civil justice or civil society is responsible for holding them to that responsibility. For the Franks, and in fact for all Germanic peoples, it's the clan or the family that's responsible. And it's responsible for both. So as a result of that, it's not necessarily the individual in his acts. If a German were to do some kind of act of violence against another person, it would not be his responsibility to have done that and then the legal authorities to bring him to justice. Rather, his act is part of his whole family.
So his whole family is guilty of the act,
Yes.
or are responsible for taking care of the act? Or
Both.
Both. Okay.
Yeah, both. Yeah.
Okay.
And so at court, a Frankish court is different from a Roman court. At court, it's no longer important that you have evidence or testimony to prove that this man is guilty.
Okay.
Okay? Instead, what you do is you appeal to the supernatural. And the supernatural will tell you whether he's guilty or not. Now, there are several layers of this.
Okay.
And the highest layer is something called compurgation. And it's an oath of innocence.
Oh, okay.
Okay. What it basically says is that if the king, here's an example, if the king were to kill somebody, okay, and he were hauled into court over this, he would simply say, I did it, but by golly, it was an accident. And you know, they'd say, well, yeah, but you pulled the sword out and you screamed something at this guy before you lopped his head off. It was, yeah, but that was like a fit of rage, you know. I'm not really responsible for that. And they go, well, okay, you're the king, and you know, you're pretty important. And so, by the very fact that he gives evidence himself, the compurgation is itself exoneration. Yeah, there's reason. So he's innocent. If you're a very important person, now keep that compurgation in mind because that's what Leo III is going to use. Okay. If you're a very important person, but not necessarily the king, let's say you're a count or you're a bishop, again, you could go before the court, give an oath on your own word, and that would be enough for the court.
Okay.
On the other hand, if you're not so important, you might have to have 12 or in some cases 25 oath helpers. And these
family.
are people, yeah, that's right. But remember that these are appealing to the supernatural, to the divine. And so that means, let's say that you have done something and you're a commoner and you've got to have 25 oath helpers, and you go to your family and say, boy, I'm in trouble. I did this bad thing, but I didn't really mean to do it. I was angry, and you know, the devil made me do it. Would you stand by me and swear an oath? That means that you have to find 25 people who are willing to put their immortal soul on the line for what might be a lie. And if you can't get 25, you're guilty.
You're dead.
Yeah, you're dead. Yeah. So that's one way of doing it. Other ways are less nice. The other way and this once again would be for someone who does not have the ability to do compurgation. Okay. So he's not important enough to be able to be believed in court. Another way is trial by ordeal. And literally what happens there is you're brought forward, your hands are opened, a red-hot iron is put in your hands, you have to carry it for a certain amount of time, then your hands are examined 3 days later. If your hands are healing, you're innocent. If your hands are festering, you're guilty.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, it could be worse.
Oh no, okay.
If
Hope you have some good salve.
Yeah, really. If you it happens during the wintertime, you will be thrown into a blessed lake, a cold blessed lake, and if you float, it'll be a sign that you have been expelled from the holy waters, and therefore you're guilty. If you sink, you're innocent. and you can only hope that they get in there and save you in
before
time.
you.
Yeah.
Oh my God!
And then the final act is trial by combat, and that would be someone of your own equal status. So those are the various ways that a Germanic, a Frankish trial might take place, and you can see it's a very different notion of the kind of law that the Romans are coming at.
Yes, something we're not used to whatsoever, I would say.
Yeah, that's yeah, right.
Wow.
There's another interesting and, quite frankly, troubling synthesis between these two, and that is the sense of ownership of what people own, and it has specifically to do, in this case, we could say with church buildings. For instance, if a church were built by a bishop or a diocese, the Franks considered that building to be owned by that bishop or that diocese, and therefore it was under the bishop's law.
Okay.
And the bishop would ordain and appoint that priest, and he would be under the bishop's law. There's a dual law system here, right? Mm-hmm. However, if that church were built by a Frank, by a German,
okay,
it would be owned by that German. And the priest who serves in that church, in that parish, would be his servant.
Okay.
Okay? It's a very strange kind of a thing. But the very concept of having individual chapels and individual churches owned by families on great estates and having full-time priests or ministers was actually continued all the way into the early 20th century in the Church of England.
Is it St. Vincent de Paul? Wasn't he the one that
great example.
Was a servant for the Queen, right?
It was the name escapes me offhand, but no, this was the minister of barges,
right,
for the entire country, and yeah, you're right, and he acted as a private chaplain for that family. Yeah, that's a good example. I'd forgotten about him. Well, by the early 600s, you really do have the Dark Ages. These really are. You have village life and agriculture on the lowest possible level. Little towns of 40 and 60 people eking out a living. Not a lot of support from the outside world. There's very little literature that's available at this period. The Merovingians, quite honestly, after that generation of fratricidal maniacs, what you have is actually a bunch of people who are just downright incompetent, and they really can't run government themselves, and they turn instead to other administrators to actually oversee the running of their countries. And these are called mayors of the palace. And in the end, that's where the real power rested with the last days of the Merovingian Empire or kingdom. And the man that they turn to is going to be a fellow by the name of Pepin of Landen.
Okay.
And it's his grandson, another Pepin, who ultimately is going to conquer all of the Germanic kingdoms in Gaul and unite them under him, basically bringing an end to the Merovingian dynasty. He himself he'll be succeeded by another Charles the Hammer, or Charles Martel, who is also going to extend conquest into northeast Germany along the coastline, an area that's known as Frisia, and then also into Bavaria. It's he, Charles Martel, who is going to make popular the Frankish instrument of the stirrup, and with that the thrusting lance. This is just an incredibly important technical innovation for being able to use a horse in battle. And as a result, he builds up heavy cavalry that we think of as the medieval knights. These were very, very helpful in the Battle of Tours in protecting Europe from a Muslim army that had made its way into, we'll talk about them a little bit later on, but in the early 700s had come out of Spain and into southern France. And while they were raiding, they decided, this would be fun. Let's go on over and destroy the pilgrimage site of St. Martin of Tours. And so they took their army and were heading to Tours when they met up. Sometimes it's called the Battle of Poitiers, and sometimes it's the Battle of Tours. But in 732, this battle takes place, and it was a great victory. It's often considered to be one of the 15 most decisive victories in battles in the history of the world.
Wow.
Had it not happened, Gaul would have become a Muslim country.
Wow.
And we might ponder as to the fate of Christianity. Had that happened. So that's an important spot. It's his son, it's Charles Martel's son, Pepin III, who was appealed to by Pope Stephen II to save him from the Lombards. We talked a little bit about that earlier on. And you have a shift then from the Merovingians to what later on is called the Carolingians, named after Charlemagne. The reason for this, historians will point to three reasons why there's a shift from this one dynasty to another in Gaul, and it's a very important shift. You're going from weakness to strength. And first of all is that the Carolingians have victories on the battlefield. Nothing wins like victory. Secondly is that they had networked over a couple generations a relationship with the nobles throughout the kingdom. It was no accident that Charles Martel was able to get all of those nobles together to defend a Tours. Okay? And then thirdly, the approval of the church. Both in Gaul and from Rome, there was a very strong sense that these are the people who are going to bring about the synthesis between Germanic and Roman civilization. They're going to create a new Europe, and these are the people that we need to be working with. And of course, that's exactly what happens, is that the popes, in the plural there, popes, begin putting more and more of their eggs in one basket. And so when Pepin III invades Italy and ultimately humiliates the Lombards and puts them back in their place, although they're going to keep on coming back. Ultimately what he'll do is, he's also known in history as Pepin the Short. He's kind of a short guy. He is going to take all of the lands that he conquers in Italy, that he takes away from these warlords. He's going to take all of those lands, cobble them together into one great big gift, put a great big bow around it, and give it to the Pope.
Wow.
And that's going to be known as the donation of Pepin.
Ah, okay.
They will be the papal states that will exist from 753 to 1870. It's only in 1870 that those lands are finally taken by the Italian government, and ultimately the great question known as the Roman question will only be solved by Pope Pius XI in the 1920s with the establishment of the Vatican City. Right. So in a sense, in a sense, the Vatican City is what's left over from the donation of Pepin. From 753 A.D.
Wow.
Now, Pepin III had two sons, Carloman and Charles. And at the time that Pepin died, so did the older son, Carloman. And so Charles then, who had received half of the Frankish kingdom, the darn Franks had a tendency to break their kingdom up equally to each of their sons,
right.
Which kind of destroys an empire, Well, he did it, but Carloman died, and so Charles then reunites the two together again. Charles has a lot on his plate. He is very much unlike his dad, it just in stature. Pepin is nicknamed the Short. Charles, you would never call short. He was in excess of 6 foot tall.
Oh my God.
At a time when most men were about 5'2", 5'4".
How interesting.
Could well have been 6'2", 6'4", and so he was a big guy. And besides, he was no beanpole. I've seen the bust of him at Aachen, and it's supposedly a full size bust. Basically the chest, shoulders, and head. And this guy would look like a football linebacker.
Wow.
He was a big guy.
That just is so interesting for me from a little somebody who'd call Pep in the short.
It's some of those genetic tricks. Anyway, he was needed to be a warrior as well as a civil ruler. He had to fight 3 wars against the Saxons, which is another Germanic group that's for the most part in central Germany. Another war against the Lombards. This he's going to do in order to save Pope Hadrian. I think we mentioned a little bit about Pope Hadrian last time around. Another war against the Bavarians. Another war against the Spanish Muslims.
Oh my gosh.
And there he really finds his first and worst defeat. And what happens is he marches this Frankish army over into northern Spain, fights, does fine, leaves a section that he calls the Spanish March, which is going to be a militarized zone, and then withdraws his main army. But as he's withdrawing his main army back over the Pyrenees Mountains, what's left of his army is going to be attacked, and the rear guard is going to be led up by a wonderful general by the name of Roland. And his heroic exploit is going to be the tales of medieval literature. The Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland, is based on that. Historians have more recently come to the conclusion that Roland was not killed by the Muslims. It was actually Basque separatists who were trying to free their own country. So fellow Christians, basically, trying to free their country from the Franks, even as they were trying to free their country from the Muslims. Keep in mind, Basque separatists are still alive and active in Spain even to today.
Wow.
There is an organization called ETA. From the Madrid government, they'll tell you that it's a terrorist organization. ETA will not consider itself a terrorist organization, but rather a freedom-fighting organization, claiming that the Basques should have their own country. It'd be basically northwest Spain. Would be that country. So we're talking about right now. This is still going on. Well, anyhow, as I say, Charles was every bit a king, and he attended Mass every day.
Wow.
And I'll say a little bit about that if we have time at the end, about the whole concept of daily Mass and how it evolves over time. But yeah, he attended Mass every day. He built his capital at the city of Aachen, which interestingly enough has 2 names.
Okay.
The German name, it's in the country of Germany today, of Aachen, but it's also referred to as Aix-la-Chapelle. Aix is the French form of Aachen, and La Chapelle is the chapel, because of the great cathedral, beautiful cathedral that Charlemagne commissioned to be built there.
I've just seen a picture of that, I think, recently.
It's quite extraordinary. It's a church in the round, built in the 700s. It's been added on to a number of times. Probably the most extraordinary thing about it, at least when I saw it, what took my breath away, was the candelabra over the altar, over the main altar. It was a gift from Friedrich Barbarossa, and it's something to behold.
Wow.
Yeah. Anyway, he's responsible for that, but even more so, he's responsible for bringing over to Aachen a great intellectual. A monk from England. His name is Alcuin of York. They had first met in Italy. I think this says something about Europe at this time, that here you have an Englishman and a German Frenchman meeting in Italy, at the city of Parma, And finally, when they met a second time, that's when Charles invited, this is of course going to be Charlemagne, but Charles invites Al-Suin to come to his kingdom and basically gives him a carte blanche. He says, I want a renaissance. Can you do this for me? And it's one of the, probably one of the rare moments in history when an intellectual gets an opportunity to establish an entire educational system for an entire country.
Wow.
That's kind of irresistible.
I would think.
The first thing he did when he arrived was he set up a school for Charlemagne's 4 boys, and then quickly extended that out to the sons of all of the nobles in that area. And then, using that as a benchmark, as a model, he then began spreading education all throughout the Frankish realm. And he did this by way of using the abbeys of the monasteries and encouraging them each to set up their own school in their own region, which would act as training centers, first of all, for future priests and for missionaries, but also just to increase the literacy. One of the problems he found was that there was no papyrus. You know, this was Northern Europe, and so everything had to be done on parchment, sheepskin, very expensive. And so it was important to write things as small as possible. And so he even developed a whole writing style called the minuscule. And he named it after Charlemagne, so it's the Carolingian minuscule. And it's the little shorthand that's used in the writing style of the age. He was absolutely perfect for this job. He had been in York. York was one of the great library centers of the Dark Ages. So much had been destroyed. All the great libraries of the Mediterranean had been destroyed. In England, most of the libraries had been destroyed. The ones that survived were basically the Irish monasteries, and they were held. These books were held, and eventually then, after it was no longer dangerous, they began sharing these books then with other monks who would then take them into a room called a scriptorium, where they would very painstakingly write these books out. You can imagine the work involved.
Oh my gosh.
I had read one time that a good monk, good efficient monk, working about 6 to 8 hours a day, could whip out 1 Bible in a year.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think about that. That doesn't seem like a whole lot, but that's a lot of pages to write out.
It is.
And how they wrote that.
Yeah.
You're just saying, picking up a pen and writing.
Yeah, that's right. And then, of course, they had to constantly experiment with ink because you couldn't go down to Walgreens, pick up a pack of ink. So they were constantly playing around with ink. You could imagine some poor monk that went ahead and spent a year of his life writing out the Bible, and he's very proud at the end. He turns back to Genesis, and it's disappeared because the ink was no good. Hence the use of confessionals. So there you have then the construction of the Carolingian Renaissance as a result of the work of Al-Suin, of these monks, of the preservation of books and the raising of general education. By the way, if you ever find yourself in Germany along the Rhine River, make sure you go to the museum in Mainz. It's called the Gutenberg Museum, named after, of course, Johannes Gutenberg, but it's got some wonderful exhibits about going all the way back and even before of writing and the history of writing, the history of print. It's really worth a visit. Anyway, he arrives in 782. Charles is in the process of finishing off his Saxon problem. It's not exactly one of the proudest moments in Carolingian history. The Saxons were, among the German peoples, one of the very few that still hung to human sacrifice and ritual cannibalism. And they didn't hanker nicely to Christianity. And at one point, they practically killed a missionary. This is Saint Leafwine, He was down in the Netherlands, Low Countries, when these Saxons caught up with him, and they whooped up on him so bad they almost killed him. They burned all the churches in the area, and that did it. And so with that, Charles called a meeting of all the Saxon nobles, and we're going to get down to the bottom of this. And basically, he gathered together in the little East German town of Verden some 4,500 Saxon nobles. Okay. And he basically said to them, either you convert or I'm going to send you off to your pagan gods. And most of them didn't convert, and he dispatched his knights, and they slaughtered almost 4,000 of them in this little village. Well, like I said, it's not exactly one of his proudest moments, but he caught everyone's attention, you know. And after that, he passed a law that anyone who was caught damaging a church, killing a priest, cremating the dead, or failing to observe Lent would be executed.
Wow.
These were capital crimes. By 799. He was called the ruler of all Christians, the father of Europe, and Alcuin used to refer to him as King David.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, it never turned his head. Well, I don't know about that part. What he did see was this, and Alcuin was quick to point out to him that Charles rested in an incredibly important position in history. Here was a moment. Alcuin points out that that civilization was like three legs on a stool, and that two of the legs were damaged. And one of those legs was the Eastern Byzantine Empire. Civilization in the East had ground to a halt in 793 when word had come that the young emperor Constantine VI had attempted to take control of the government from his mother, Irene II. And remember when we were talking about the Byzantines, she had his eyes gouged out,
That's right.
remember?
Yes.
And then she took over as Basilos, as king herself, using the male term, not as queen, but as king. And he died of the experience. It was so horrible. So you have that. That's one stool. One leg of the stool, and then the other leg of the stool was the new Pope, Pope Leo III, and he was having problems down in Rome, and so this is when Alcuin tells Charles, you have all the authority, all of the responsibility to save Western civilization now. You can't rely on the Byzantines to do it. The Pope has been weakened. I'll explain why in a couple minutes. But you have to go to the Pope and to save him. And you have to reestablish this great Roman Empire upon Christian grounds. Now, what we're seeing here is the foundation for the Holy Roman Empire. This is, let's not use that term yet. That hasn't come about. But the idea is there, and it's in the mind of Alcuin, and he's planting in the mind of Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. Hadrian I had some real problems himself, but if you remember that after he'd been saved by the Franks, that he later went on and served as Pope for 23 years, and it was a wonderful papacy. Now that 23 years is one of the longest papacies in history, but also one of the longest in ancient and medieval times. He was from a noble family. He had built a close relationship with the Franks. He had secured the Papal States, Pepin's donation, against the Lombards, against the Dukes of Spoleto, and against the Duke of Benevento. Remember that he had put additions onto St. Peter's and to St. John Lateran. I think, wasn't it last time around we talked about the wonderful work that he had done by fixing up his own farm, his own family farm, and then fed the people of Rome with that. Just a beautiful thing. There's only one thing wrong with this. It's a tough act to follow, And when the priests of Rome got together on the day that Hadrian died. They moved very quickly, and they decided to elect one of their own, a simple Roman priest. He took the title Leo, and he had not had an important position. He wasn't some kind of a big Monsignor someplace, or or from a noble family, from a common family. But he had been a clerk, just a clerk in what's called the papal vestiarum, which is the papal treasury. So he's sort of like an accountant. Mm-hmm. He was not a great leader, but obviously the priests must have had a great respect for him. And boy, they were right. But he is going to have a hard time right from the very beginning. He's going to have a hard act to follow behind Hadrian, for one thing. Also, many of the Roman nobles who had come to love Hadrian, he was one of their own, are going to look on this guy, and they're going to see, hey, he's beneath us. They're not going to see the office of the Pope. They're going to see a simple priest. Mm-hmm. And two of them in particular are going to be just enemies of his. One of them is named Pascal, and he's a nephew of the previous Pope, and he feels that he has been slighted. He wanted something more.
Those nephews.
Those nephews. And the other one was a man by the name of Campulus, and he basically was the paymaster for the Vatican. And he felt that he wasn't being given enough. Well, these two got together, and they started making rumors about Leo. Mm-hmm. And these were absolutely unfounded rumors about claiming that he was living an immoral life and all. Ultimately, these rumors are going to get to Charlemagne, to Aachen. Ultimately, he's going to look in on this. Ultimately, Leo is going to be physically attacked. There's a group that's going to try to gouge his eyes out.
Oh, my gosh.
And he's going to be saved by a crowd. But all of this is now a setup, really, for what's going to ultimately happen at Christmas of 800 A.D., when you have coming together Pope Leo III and Charles the Great, Charlemagne, and then the establishment, really, of the Holy Roman Empire by these two guys.
Who had tried to thwart it in a sense?
Yes.
You don't mean by Pascal and...
No.
But by Charlemagne or Charles and
Leo. In a sense, the two conspirators helped bring about this because they forced the hand and they moved history on into the next logical step.
All right.
Yeah. So those are Germans. Those are darn Germans.
Well, in the long run, maybe their work turned things around, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. All right, Father, shall we close with a prayer and your blessing?
Yeah. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.